Chapter 1. Invisible Girl. Evie Carter had mastered the art of blending in. At school, she wasn't the loud one. She wasn't the pretty one, the funny one, or the one people whispered about in hallways. She wasn't anything really, just a girl who occupied space in a desk, a seat at the lunch table, a name on the attendance sheet, and that was fine. She had convinced herself a long time ago that it was better this way. It was better to be the girl no one really noticed than to be the girl people mocked, judged, picked apart. Still, sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to be seen, to walk into a room and have heads turn, to have people actually listen when she spoke, to take up space and not apologize for it. But Evie didn't take up space, she just existed, and no one really cared. "You should come," her mom said, adjusting one of the balloons tied to a chair. Evie hovered near the kitchen counter, arms folded, watching as her mom frantically arranged cupcakes for her sister's birthday party. It was always like this. Her younger sister Harper was the center of everything. The one people noticed, the one who had friends and hobbies and a real life. And Evie, she was just the extra daughter, the one people forgot to invite places. "I don't think a bunch of 13-year-olds want me at their party," Evie said, voice flat. Her mom didn't argue. She just nodded, distracted, and went back to setting up Harper's perfect birthday celebration. Evie took the out. She grabbed her bag, mumbled something about going out for a bit, and left. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going, because that was the thing about being invisible. No one ever noticed when you left. Evie ended up at the park, sitting on a bench, watching people move around her. A group of girls from school laughed near the swings, taking selfies, fixing their hair, posting themselves online for the world to admire. A couple walked past, hands intertwined, wrapped in their own world, and Evie just sat there. Fading. It had always been like this. She had spent her entire life feeling small, not just in size, but in the way she occupied the world. It was like she wasn't meant to be the kind of girl who mattered. She had tried once. When she was younger, she had tried to make people notice her, to make her mom pay attention, to make friends, to feel like she belonged somewhere. But the more she had tried, the more it became clear. She wasn't built for that kind of life. She wasn't one of the pretty girls. She wasn't one of the popular girls. She wasn't one of the girls people obsessed over, texted late at night, whispered about in hallways. She was just Evie, a background character in her own life, and maybe that was all she'd ever be. Later that night, she stared at herself in the mirror. She examined every inch of her reflection, the curve of her stomach, the roundness of her face, the way her arms weren't slim and delicate like the girls at school. She turned sideways, sucked in her stomach. It wasn't enough. She wasn't enough, and that was when the thought slid in, quiet, simple, almost unnoticeable at first. Maybe if I were smaller, people would see me. Maybe if she could control this one thing, the rest wouldn't feel so impossible. Maybe if she could just take up less space, everything else would hurt a little less. Evie exhaled slowly, and then, for the first time, she made the decision to disappear. Chapter 2. A Game of Control. The first time Evie skipped a meal, it felt easy. She had spent years watching girls in movies pick at their salads, models in magazines talk about their clean eating routines, influencers online rave about discipline like it was some kind of secret weapon. So when she left breakfast untouched, when she pushed food around her plate at dinner instead of eating it, no one noticed. And that was the thing. It wasn't hard to disappear. It was just about control. The first day, she ignored hunger. The second day, it became a challenge. By the third day, the hunger pangs weren't a punishment. They were proof. Proof that she was stronger than she thought. Proof that she had willpower. Proof that she could finally control something. She kept track. Calories, steps, the number on the scale. When she skipped meals, she felt powerful. When her stomach twisted in protest, it felt like she was winning. It became a game, and she was determined to win. A week passed before someone noticed. She was standing at her locker when she heard it. "You've lost weight." Evie turned, blinking in surprise. It was Lily Adams, one of those effortlessly pretty girls. She stood with two other girls from the track team, sipping iced coffees, wearing matching, effortless smiles. Evie had never been on Lily's radar, but now Lily was looking at her. "Seriously," Lily said, eyes sweeping over her. "You look good." "Good." Evie barely registered her own mumbled thank you before the girls walked away, moving on with their conversation. But Evie wasn't moving on. She was memorizing the moment, the way it felt to have someone notice, the way her chest tightened with pride, the way one small change could make a difference. And suddenly, she didn't feel like a background character. She felt like she was winning. By the time lunch rolled around, Evie had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. She sat with the same group of people, laughed in the right places, pretended to scroll on her phone while others ate. No one asked questions, no one noticed, except for Liam. He sat across from her, arms crossed, watching. "You're not eating," he said. Evie blinked, startled. No one ever called her out like that. She forced a light laugh. "I'm just not hungry." Liam didn't look convinced. "You skipped lunch yesterday, too." Evie's stomach clenched, not from hunger, but from the way he was looking at her, like he actually saw her. "Are you keeping tabs on me?" she joked, trying to make light of it. Liam didn't laugh. "Just saying, it's weird." Evie rolled her eyes. "It's really not." Liam studied her for a second longer, then shrugged. "Whatever." And just like that, he let it go. Evie should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something else. Something like fear. Because if Liam could see through her this early, what happened when someone else did too? What happened when she was no longer in control? Another week passed. The hunger got easier to ignore. The numbers on the scale started going down, and with them, so did Evie. She started waking up lightheaded, but convinced herself it was a good thing. She sat through class feeling hollow and cold, but took it as proof that she was doing it right. She saw her reflection and thought, "Not enough. I can go further." Because she wasn't just losing weight. She was losing herself. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be found. Chapter 3: The Weight of Perfection. Evie used to hate the scale. It had always been a reminder of everything she wasn't. She used to avoid it, afraid of the number that would flash back at her, proof that she was too much, too soft, too ordinary. But now it was her favorite thing. She stepped onto it every morning before school, before she let a single bite of food pass her lips. And when the number went down, it felt like validation, like she was finally getting closer to something. She just wasn't sure what. She was in history class when she heard it again. "You've lost weight." Evie looked up, pulse kicking up slightly. This time, it wasn't Lily Adams. It was Megan Reese, one of the most effortlessly beautiful girls in school. She had perfect skin, perfect hair, a perfect life, and now she was noticing Evie. "You look amazing," Megan added, giving her a once-over. "I swear, I wish I had your willpower." Willpower. Evie smiled, shifting in her seat to hide the fact that her hands were trembling from hunger. She told herself it was pride. She ignored the way her stomach twisted painfully underneath her desk. A dangerous routine. Evie had her rules. 1. 800 calories a day. 2. No food after 6 p.m. 3. If she eats, she exercises. If she doesn't exercise, she doesn't eat. It was all about control, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she finally had it. Until she didn't. "Evie, you're shaking." She blinked, looking up from her notebook. Liam was frowning at her, his eyes sharp, focused. "I'm fine," she muttered, curling her fingers into fists under the desk. "You sure?" he pressed. "Because you look like you're about to pass out." Her stomach clenched. Why did he have to notice? Evie forced a laugh, brushing her hair over her shoulder. "I'm fine," she repeated. "Just tired." Liam didn't look convinced, but before he could argue, the bell rang. Evie exhaled in relief, grabbing her things before he could question her again. She was in control. She was fine. Liam just didn't get it. No one did. That night, Evie stood in front of the mirror, studying her reflection. She was smaller now, her collarbones sharper, her ribs starting to show. She felt light, empty, powerful. But then, her vision blurred. The room tilted. And before she could grab onto something, her knees buckled. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own body hitting the floor. Chapter 4. Fading Away. Evie woke up on the floor, her cheek pressed against the cold tile of her bathroom. Her head throbbed. Her arms felt weak. For a second she didn't move, just stared at the cracks in the ceiling, trying to make sense of what happened. Then she remembered. The mirror, the dizziness, the way the room had spun out of control. She pushed herself up, gripping the edge of the counter as she pulled herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, her stomach twisted in protest. But when she looked into the mirror, none of that mattered. All she saw were the sharp angles of her collarbones, the way her waist dipped in slightly more than before. She ignored the faint shadow under her eyes, ignored the way her hands still shook, because this was working, and she wasn't about to stop now. At school the next day, she was running on black coffee and willpower. The hunger was constant now, a dull, familiar ache in the pit of her stomach. But she had learned to love it. It meant she was doing something right. It meant she was still winning. "Evie, seriously, you look amazing," Lily said at lunch, eyeing her from across the table. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Evie took a sip of her coffee, ignoring the way her hands trembled slightly around the cup. "Thanks," she said, forcing a small smile. Lily leaned in. "I mean it. You've got, crazy willpower." Willpower. She clung to the word like a lifeline, like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away. "You didn't eat again," Evie sighed, not even turning around as Liam fell into step beside her after school. "Not this again," she muttered. "Yeah, this again," he said. "I don't get it. Are you trying to disappear?" Her stomach clenched. She forced a laugh. "Obviously not." "Then what the hell are you doing?" His voice wasn't angry, it was worried, and for some reason that was worse. "I'm fine, Liam," she said, rolling her eyes. "Why do you care?" Liam stopped walking. She should have kept going. She should have walked away. But instead, she turned, because something in his expression made her feel like she couldn't breathe. "Because you mean a lot, me, and I don't like seeing this happen," he said. Evie froze. Liam held her gaze, his brows furrowed, his jaw tight. "I don't know what's going on with you, but I know it's not good, and I know you're lying to me, to yourself." Evie's heart pounded. For a second, just a second, she wanted to tell him everything. But then Lily's voice echoed in her head. "You've got crazy willpower." And suddenly telling the truth felt like losing. So instead, she forced a fake smile. "I don't need you to save me, Liam," she said. Then she turned and walked away. And she told herself it didn't hurt, that she wasn't already falling apart. That night, Evie stared at her reflection again. She took in the hollowness of her cheeks, the way her clothes hung slightly looser on her frame. She should have been happy, but she just felt tired. So tired. Her vision blurred again, her legs felt weak again, and this time when she collapsed, she didn't wake up right away. Chapter 5. Liam Knows. Evie woke up on the floor again. Her body felt like lead, every limb weighed down by exhaustion. Her mouth was dry, her head was pounding, and for the first time she felt something close to fear. This wasn't normal, this wasn't winning. But before she could sit up, before she could convince herself it didn't matter, her phone buzzed from where it had fallen beside her. She reached for it, fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. Liam, you weren't in class today. Liam, are you okay? Liam, Evie, answer me. She stared at the messages, heart pounding. Liam didn't just text people. He wasn't the type to check in, to push, which meant he knew. And suddenly she wasn't just lightheaded, she was terrified. Evie showed up to school the next day acting like nothing was wrong, because if she pretended hard enough, maybe it would be true. But the second she walked into the building, Liam was already waiting. He stood by her locker, arms crossed, eyes sharp and unreadable. Evie exhaled sharply. Seriously? You didn't answer my texts. She forced a casual shrug. I was busy. Doing what? Evie clenched her jaw, shoving books into her locker. Why do you care so much? Liam didn't hesitate. Because I know what you're doing to yourself. Her entire body tensed. For a second she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Because he knew. He wasn't just suspicious anymore. He knew. And Evie had no idea how to handle that. So she did the only thing she was good at. She lied. You're imagining things, she said, slamming her locker shut. I'm fine, Liam. Drop it. Liam stared at her, and for the first time he looked angry. Not in the way most people got angry. Liam's anger was quiet, controlled, but it burned. You're not fine, he said, voice low, firm. You look like you're barely hanging on. Evie's chest tightened. I don't need you to. I saw you pass out. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her throat closed up. What? Liam exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Yesterday in the hallway. You were walking toward the exit and then you just went down. Evie's vision blurred at the edges. She had been so used to feeling lightheaded that she had brushed off the moments of dizziness the way the world tilted. But this was worse. She had blacked out completely. And Liam had seen. Her fingers dug into her palms. You can't keep doing this, he said, stepping closer, his voice softer now. Evie, this isn't just some diet. You're hurting yourself. Her throat felt tight, because she wanted to argue, to push him away, to tell him he didn't understand. But the truth was, she didn't understand either. She had thought this was about control. But lately she felt completely out of it. So instead of fighting, instead of denying it, she just left. She turned on her heel and walked away, because if she stayed any longer, she might have cracked. That night, Evie lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She should have been scared. Liam knew. Her body was starting to give up on her. She had blacked out, collapsed, nearly exposed herself to everyone. She should have been scared. But instead, all she could focus on was the hunger gnawing at her ribs, and that meant she was still in control. Right? She rolled onto her side, gripping her blanket tightly. I can stop whenever I want. That was what she told herself as she ignored the hunger, ignored Liam's voice in her head, ignored the fear curling inside her. She could stop whenever she wanted. She just wasn't ready yet. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. Evie had spent so long telling herself she was fine that she almost believed it, until the moment she wasn't. She sat at her desk in first period, fingers curled around her pen, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping in. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. Every bite felt like failure. Every meal was a battle she had to win, but now, sitting in class, her body felt different. Her limbs were heavy, her head pounded, her vision kept going in and out of focus. She forced herself to sit up straighter, to ignore the shaking in her hands. Just get through the day. Just keep going. Her pencil slipped from her fingers. She reached for it, but her arms felt slow, unresponsive. The edges of her vision blurred, then flickered, and then everything went black. She came to with a rush of voices. Something cold was pressed against her forehead. The scent of antiseptic and cheap perfume filled the air. Evie blinked, head pounding. She was in the nurse's office, and sitting in the chair beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched, was Liam. She groaned, pressing her fingers to her temple. Seriously? Liam let out a breath that sounded more like a curse. "You passed out," he said flatly. Evie rolled her eyes, forcing herself to sit up. "It's not a big deal." Liam's stare could have burned a hole through her. "Not a big deal?" His voice was sharp, borderline furious. "You collapsed in the middle of class, Evie. The teacher thought you had a seizure." Her stomach clenched. They almost called an ambulance." Evie's blood ran cold. She gripped the sides of the cot. "They didn't, right?" Liam exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "No, the nurse convinced them to hold off unless it happened again." She let out a breath. "Okay, so no harm done." Liam's head snapped up. "Are you kidding?" His voice was dangerous now. "Evie, do you even hear yourself? You blacked out. Twice. That's not normal." She hated the way her throat felt tight, hated the way she could feel herself losing. She forced a smirk. "So what, you're my doctor now?" Liam's hands clenched into fists. "You're killing yourself," he said, voice quiet, strained, "and you don't even see it." Her breath caught. For the first time, his words hit something inside her, something she had been trying to ignore, because deep down, she did see it. She saw it every time she woke up dizzy, every time her body refused to move the way it should, every time she looked in the mirror and felt nothing but exhaustion. She saw it. She just didn't know how to stop. The nurse walked in before Evie could respond. She gave them both a pointed look. "Evie, you're free to go, but I want you to eat something first." Evie's stomach twisted. The thought of food made her feel sick. But Liam was still watching her, and for the first time she felt like she couldn't lie to him, so she didn't. She stood, legs still unsteady, and turned to him. "I don't know how to stop." The words came out before she could take them back. Liam's expression softened. For the first time there was no anger in his eyes, just understanding. "Then let me help," he said, and Evie, for the first time in a long time, thought maybe, just maybe, she would let him. Chapter 7. A Truth She Can't Ignore. Evie had spent so long hiding that telling the truth felt wrong. Admitting she didn't know how to stop wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be stronger than this. She was supposed to be in control. But now, sitting in the back of Liam's car after school, she felt like she had never been in control at all. Liam drove in silence. Not angry silence. Not the kind of silence that was waiting to explode, but the kind that was heavy with things unsaid. Evie watched the streets blur past, her hands clenched in her lap. She should have never said anything. She should have laughed it off, told him he was imagining things, but she hadn't. And now, Liam was looking at her like she was something breakable, like she was someone who needed saving. And Evie wasn't sure she knew how to be that person. Liam pulled into a quiet parking lot, shifting into park. Evie blinked, finally looking at him. What are we doing?" Liam exhaled, gripping the steering wheel for a second before turning toward her. "Are you ready to stop?" The question knocked the air out of her, because it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't demanding. It was just a question, a simple one she didn't know how to answer. Her throat tightened. Liam didn't look away. "Because if you are, I'll help you. But you have to want to stop, Evie. No one else can make you." She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him she was done, that she would start eating again, that she would fix it, but she couldn't force the words out, because the fear was still there, because the thought of stopping felt like losing, because she didn't know who she was without this. So instead she whispered, "I don't know." Liam nodded, like he had expected that answer. "Okay." Evie frowned. "Okay?" "Yeah," he said. "You don't have to know today." She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, because for the first time someone wasn't telling her what she should do. He was just waiting, and for once, waiting didn't feel like pressure. Evie barely made it inside before her mom's voice stopped her cold. "You passed out at school today?" Her stomach plummeted. She turned, finding her mom standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, worried, anxious, tired. Evie's mouth went dry. "Who told you?" Your school called. Of course they did. Evie should have expected that. She forced a shrug. It was just a dizzy spell, not a big deal. Her mom's jaw clenched. Evie, stop! Evie froze. Her mom never spoke like that, never looked at her like that, like she was afraid. Her voice softened. I've noticed you've been losing weight. The words made Evie's whole body go rigid. Not a lot, her mom added quickly, but enough. Enough that I should have said something sooner. Evie felt something tighten in her chest, because she had convinced herself her mom didn't notice her at all. And now, here she was, noticing, caring, and Evie didn't know what to do with that. I just want to know the truth, her mom said, voice quiet. Evie hesitated, because the truth was messy. The truth was hard. The truth was something she hadn't even fully accepted herself. But Liam's voice echoed in her head. Are you ready to stop? Evie swallowed hard. I don't know, she whispered. Her mom's face crumpled, not in anger, not in disappointment, but in something else, something softer. She reached for Evie's hand. Can we figure it out together? Evie should have pulled away, should have laughed it off, pretended it was all in their heads. But for the first time, she didn't fight it. She just nodded and let herself be held. Chapter 8. The Fear of Existing. Evie had never been afraid of food before, but now, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-eaten granola bar in front of her, she felt like she was staring down a loaded gun. Her mom sat across from her, trying to look casual, but Evie could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't like her mom had forced her to eat. She had just set the granola bar down, said, "You should have something," and waited. And now Evie's entire body was at war. Her stomach growled, desperate for food. Her brain screamed not to do it. Her fingers trembled as she broke off a tiny piece. It was too much. She couldn't do this. Her breath came too fast. Her skin felt too tight. She shoved back from the table. I can't. Her mom's face fell, but she didn't argue. Instead, she just nodded. Okay. And that was somehow worse. Evie barely made it to her room before her phone buzzed. Liam. Are you okay? She should have ignored it, but her fingers moved before she could stop them. Evie. I tried to eat. Liam. How did that go? Evie. I don't know. A pause. Then, Liam, that's okay. Evie stared at the screen, her chest tightening. He didn't tell her to try harder. He didn't tell her to just eat. He just let her be. And for some reason, that made her want to cry. The next morning, Evie sat in the passenger seat of Liam's car, watching him drum his fingers against the steering wheel. You don't have to do this, she muttered. Liam shot her a look. Yeah, I do. Evie swallowed. What if I fail? He didn't hesitate. Then you try again. And somehow, that was enough. They ended up at a quiet diner, tucked into a corner booth where no one could see her shaking hands. Liam didn't push her. He just ordered his food like normal, sat across from her, and waited. Evie stared at her plate. She had asked for something small, a plain piece of toast, a side of fruit. She could do this. She could try. She picked up the toast, took a tiny bite, and the world didn't end. Her stomach didn't revolt. The sky didn't fall. She was still here, still existing, and maybe that was okay. Chapter 9. The First Step Back. Evie had never thought a single bite of food could feel like such a victory. It wasn't easy. Every instinct told her to stop, to push the plate away, to walk out of the diner and pretend this never happened. But she didn't. She sat across from Liam, staring at her half-eaten toast, and for the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could do this. Liam didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't say, "See, that wasn't so hard." He didn't act like she had just solved everything. Instead, he leaned back in the booth and took a sip of his drink. So, that physics test is going to kill me this week. Evie blinked. What? He shrugged. I mean, unless you want to talk about how you just ate a bite of toast like a total badass. She snorted. That's your definition of badass? Absolutely. Evie rolled her eyes. But for the first time in a long time, the weight in her chest didn't feel so crushing. Later that night, Evie stood in front of the mirror. She had done this 100 times, turned sideways, stared at the places she thought needed to be smaller. But this time, she saw something different. She saw a girl who was still here. A girl who had taken a bite of food today, and the world hadn't ended. A girl who wasn't winning or losing, but maybe just existing. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Her stomach growled, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a reminder that she was still alive, that she still deserved to be. The next morning, Evie walked into the kitchen, half expecting her mom to hover, to comment, to make it weird. But instead, she just smiled. Want some eggs? Evie hesitated. You don't have to, her mom said quickly, but I'm making them, and I'd like to sit with you. Something tightened in Evie's chest. She wasn't ready for this. Not completely, but she thought about the toast, about the fact that she had eaten, and it hadn't felt like losing, and she thought about how tired she was, of running, of hiding, of shrinking, so she inhaled slowly and said, "Okay." Her mom blinked, surprised, but covered it quickly. Great. Evie sat down, heart pounding. It wasn't easy, but maybe it didn't have to be. Chapter 10. Learning to Take Up Space. Evie sat at the kitchen table staring at the plate in front of her. Her mom had kept it simple. A scrambled egg, a slice of toast, and a few apple slices. Nothing overwhelming, nothing that felt impossible. But it was still food, and that made it terrifying. Her mom sat across from her, pretending to be casual, flipping through a magazine like this was just another normal morning. Evie swallowed hard. You don't have to eat it all. You don't have to finish it. Just take a bite. She reached for the toast, broke off a small piece, and forced herself to chew. Her mom didn't say anything, didn't praise her, didn't make it weird. She just let her eat, and somehow that made it easier. The rest of the day felt different. Not better, not fixed, just different. She wasn't used to listening to her body. So when her stomach growled that afternoon, she spent 10 full minutes standing in the kitchen, arguing with herself. You don't need to eat again. You already had breakfast. You've gone longer without food before. But then another voice. A newer one. Quieter, but steady. You can eat if you're hungry. It doesn't make you weak. She grabbed a granola bar, unwrapped it, and took a bite, and for the first time, it didn't feel like failure. Liam texted her that night. Liam, how's the whole being a badass thing going? Evie smiled. Evie, I ate breakfast today. Liam, hell yeah, let's go. Evie, it was just eggs and toast. Liam, and? You're basically a champion, I'm impressed. Evie, you set the bar really low. Liam, nope, I just know that when you're fighting your own brain, every win counts. Her smile faded slightly, because she wasn't used to someone getting it. She wasn't used to someone paying attention and still choosing to stay. Evie, thanks. Liam, for what? Evie, I don't know, just thanks. She put her phone down, heart lighter than before. The next morning, Evie stood in front of her mirror. She had done this 100 times before, turned sideways, checked for progress, measured herself in places no one else cared about. But this time, she didn't analyze. She didn't search for flaws. She didn't think about disappearing. She just saw a girl who was still here. A girl who had eaten breakfast and hadn't fallen apart. A girl who, for the first time in a long time, was choosing to stay. She took a deep breath, pressing a hand to her stomach. For the first time, she didn't wish it was smaller. For the first time, she was okay with existing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 11. The Art of Being Seen. Evie had spent so long trying to disappear that she had forgotten what it felt like to exist. Not just to be here, but to take up space, to live. And for the first time in a long time, She wanted to try. She didn't wake up magically healed. She didn't look in the mirror and suddenly love everything about herself. But she did one thing differently. She ate breakfast, and she didn't punish herself for it. She didn't count the calories. She didn't double-check her reflection. She didn't let the fear win. She just sat at the table, ate her toast, and let herself exist. And that was enough. At school, Liam fell into step beside her, hands in his pockets. "So, what's the verdict?" Evie raised an eyebrow. "On what?" "On you, obviously," he said. "Are you still the same person, or did eating breakfast turn you into an alien?" She snorted. "Guess you'll have to wait and see." Liam grinned. "I can work with that." And for the first time, she laughed without thinking about how her body looked when she did. That afternoon, she sat in her room, legs crossed, phone in her lap. She thought about how easy it would be to slip back, how simple it would be to just skip the next meal, to let herself fall back into old habits. But she also thought about how hard she had fought to get here. She wasn't better yet. She wasn't done fighting. But she was trying. And that was what mattered. She picked up her phone and typed, "Evie, hey, do you want to get something to eat later?" Liam's reply was almost instant. Liam, "Who are you and what have you done with Evie Carter?" Evie, "Shut up." Liam, "No, seriously. Yeah, let's do it. I'm proud of you." Her chest tightened, not in a bad way, not in the way it used to when she thought about food, but in the way that reminded her she was still here, that she was choosing to be. That night, Evie stood in front of her mirror. She turned sideways, just like she used to. But this time, she didn't analyze. She didn't pick herself apart. She just existed. She ran a hand over her stomach, over her arms. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what she needed to lose. She was thinking about what she wanted to gain. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take up space again. Epilogue, 10 years after graduation. The reunion was exactly what Evie expected. A little awkward, a little nostalgic, and a lot of people pretending they hadn't spent the last 10 years stalking each other on social media. She hadn't been sure she wanted to come, but her husband had nudged her toward the idea, saying it could be fun. And now, standing in the old high school gym, decorated with too many twinkling lights and an overambitious balloon arch, she was glad she did. Because across the room, laughing at something his wife said, was Liam Mercer. And the moment their eyes met, it was like no time had passed at all. "Evie Carter," Liam greeted as he approached, his trademark smirk still intact. "I wasn't sure you'd show." She grinned. "I wasn't sure either." His eyes flicked down, and she knew exactly what he was looking at. Her daughter, a carbon copy of herself at 7 years old, clutching her little brother's hand as they danced wildly in the corner with the other kids. Liam let out a soft huff of amusement. "She looks just like you." Evie shook her head. "No," she said, voice gentle but firm. "She's different." Liam's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't push. He just waited, the same way he always had. Evie turned toward her daughter, watching the way she laughed freely, twirled without hesitation, moved through the world like she belonged in it. "I make sure she always feels seen," she said quietly, "heard, like she never has to fight to exist the way I did." She glanced back at Liam. "I will never let her feel the way I once did." Something softened in his face. "I believe you," he murmured. And God, that meant everything. "So," Evie said, shaking off the emotion with a smirk, "when are we getting the families together?" Liam chuckled. "You actually want to hang out with me again?" "I think I can handle you in small doses." He grinned. "Sounds like a challenge. You cook?" "Not really," she admitted, "but I can bring cake, or toast, whichever you prefer." Liam let out a deep, real laugh at that. "I remember how hard that toast was for you." Evie's smile faltered for a second, not in sadness, but in a moment of reflection. Then she exhaled and said, "My daughter will never be afraid to eat toast." Liam looked at her for a long moment. Then, before she could react, he leaned forward and pressed a lingering, chaste kiss to her forehead. A silent thank you. A silent, I see you. When he pulled back, he squeezed her shoulder and turned to his wife, taking her hand in his own. Evie's husband appeared beside her, watching the interaction with casual curiosity. He was nice, he remarked, his tone absent, like it was just an observation. Evie smiled, eyes still on Liam as he disappeared into the crowd. He's the best, she murmured. A really good friend when I needed one the most. Her husband pressed a kiss to her temple. Ready to head out? She nodded. They walked across the gym, their children running ahead, laughing and shrieking with joy. And as she followed after them, no longer afraid to take up space, no longer afraid to exist, Evie knew she had made it, not just to the reunion, but to the life she had always deserved. And this time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living,